Wu Yun roaming on Mount Yidi. How uniquely graceful is this mountain? 80,000 feet high, it leans against a vast azure sky. At daybreak, I clamber up to the foot of mist and clouds. At dusk, I rest in the field of the numinous immortals. Bowing down, I behold the moon above the sea. Sitting down, I toy with the drifting clouds that roam about. The wind shakes a refined melody from the pine trees. The dew upon the cassia contains the glow of the clear sky. Without having to pass beyond the six realms, I reach transcendents, and the myriad ties are forgotten. I put my faith in those gentlemen of days long gone, roosting among cliffs. The way entirely manifests itself. Okay, so Wu Jun is, like some of the figures we've been encountering lately, a relatively important Daoist master and, on the side, a poet. He flourished during the early 8th century, and, well, he spent most of his time living in the mountains. One of them was Mount Yidi Shan, which is the source of inspiration for the poem we have just read. But he would travel far and wide. He would stay in the capital. After the An rebellion, he mostly went south, and he had quite a lot of poems on Mount Mao, which is one of the sacred places and the center for the Shangqing, or highest clarity Daoist school. Yeah, and he had quite close contacts with the emperor. A lot of Tang emperors were interested in Taoism. Xuanzong was particularly interested in Taoism himself, and he summoned him to court a couple of times, and he even gave him important positions the second time in the Hanling Academy. But yeah, as I said, just before the An rebellion, he left. There are some legends that this Daoist figure also had contacts with Li Bai and that would have recommended him to court, but this is not completely verifiable. Anyway, the poem we've just read is a pretty typical example both of Shanshui landscape poetry, but also of the landscape poetry that is associated with Taoism. Remember, for Taoism, mountains are numinous and sacred places. Some of them contain grottos or passages that lead to inner worlds of the immortals. Previous Taoist sages have retired to different numinous mountains to practice asceticism and different dietary and meditative practices that presumably had allowed them to transcend the world, to become transcendents. I think we've read a lot of poems like this, both in the current videos and in the 300 Tang anthology videos. I think I remember there's a poem by Li Bai in that anthology that really brings to mind this one also, which also has, the poet climbing into the mountain and experiencing a vision of Taoist worthies and joining them. So, the topic of this poem, landscape poetry, but also retirement from the world, abandoning the red dust, and following the path previously followed by Taoist sages so as to achieve a shot at immortality or at long life. Yeah? The search for the way, the search for the Tao is transmuted into this climbing up, exploring and staying in this sacred mountain. Okay, having given this general appreciation of the poet and the topics of the poem, let's take a look at it as usual, couplet by couplet. Before going into it, it's important to note I'm not sure what metrical form this poem belongs to. Maybe it's an old style poem. The lines are pentasyllabic, but we've got 12 lines. It's six, one couplet, two. Yeah, you got 12 lines, which is 6 couplets. Yeah? Whereas the usual thing for, for a regulated poem if I remember well, is 8 lines. That is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 4 couplets. Anyway, as I said, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. How uniquely graceful is this mountain? 8,000 feet high, it leans against the vast azure sky. So the poem from the title we know is about roaming Mount Yidi. So the first couplet describes the first impressions the poetic persona gets of the mountain, presumably before starting the climb and before roaming about. At the foot of the mountain, the poet looks up and, he is impressed by the gracefulness and the elevation of the mountain. It says 80,000 feet high. It leans against the vast azure sky. So it's an enormous peak. Probably it's leaning against the vast azure sky. It's meant to be symbolic. Azure is the color associated with divine attendants as well as with elixirs of immortality. So it's, evoking, it's prefiguring the idea or implicitly laying down the idea that this is an abode of immortals or a place where one can commune with them or turn into them with greater ease than at other places. Second couplet, at daybreak I clamber up to the foot of mist and clouds. At dusk I rest in the field of the numinous immortals. So usually the first couplet of a poem locates us in time and place. Here it located us in place. As for time, we get the second couplet. We don't get the season or the time of year or any other events, but we get a summary of what the poet does after reaching the mountain. He spends all day in it, and he arrives early and goes up, explores the mountain, and at the end of the day, he is still in the mountain, probably in some plain, in some field, in some valley high up in the mountain, which is equated or associated with a field where immortals dwell, where immortals roam. And this is a parallelistic couplet. I think the next one, two, at least the next two couplets are also parallelistic. One, two, third couplet. Bowing down, I behold the moon above the sea. Sitting down, I toy with the drifting clouds that roam about. So the previous couplet told us that the poet has been roaming around the mountains all day, but what has he been specifically doing? Remember, when we have these landscape and descriptive poems, usually each couplet, as we follow the series, zooms in into specific details and also into greater subjectivity. So we had in couplet 2 a general description of going around. In couplet 3, we get specific things the poet does, basically 2. So he looks down, and probably the sea is relatively far away but visible. So he bows down on the mountain, and he sees the moon floating above the sea. It's a typical image of illumination, although here it might just be, a landscape, a beautiful sight. Yeah. So the moon is above the sea, and also sitting down, he toys with the drifting clouds that roam about. So we've got the moon over the waters and the clouds floating around, and the poet positioning himself so that he can see and play with these natural phenomena. The clouds also are very typical in Daoist and Buddhist poetry as symbols for uprootedness and for the hermit or the sage that moves around searching for the truth and is not tied to a specific place, and even less to the world. So he is there enjoying the nature, looking at the moon over the waves, probably at night or very early morning, and playing with the clouds, seeing the clouds float by. Fourth couplet. The wind shakes a refined melody from the pine trees. The dew upon the cassia contains the glow of the clear sky. So again, you could say that this couplet focuses even more on specific elements. What's interesting is in this couplet, agency moves from the poet to nature. In the previous couplet, the poet is sitting down or bowing down. In this couplet, nature is doing things. Basically, the wind and the dew are the ones that get agentic, that get personified. What is the wind doing? It's creating music. Yeah? The shakes, a refined melody from the pine trees. So the poet is listening, and the wind blowing through the pine trees seems to create a delightful melody. Also, the dew, well, the dew would fall probably at dawn or maybe at night, depending on the season of the year. But the dew is on the cassia, which is a parent of the cinnamon tree. And just as the wind creates music, the dew upon the cassia creates a sight, a lovely sight. It encapsulates, it absorbs, it reflects the glow of the clear sky. So this is a very typical parallelistic couplet. So the first couplet has the wind making music, so the natural making the artificial, and also creating an oral element of sound. In the second couplet, we also have the natural creating the artificial in a way. The dew creates a glow, creates a light, yeah, or absorbs the light like a jewel. That is dew as jewel, absorbing the shininess, the brightness of the sky. And so again, we have this union of nature and culture. Yeah, this is very typical also in poems describing imperial gardens and pleasure places. But there is a real juxtaposition of the nature and the rich, beautiful aspects of culture, whether it be music or clothes or jewelry or whatever. Here it's metaphorical. Fifth couplet. So with this couplet, the description more or less finishes, and the next couplet, the fifth couplet, moves to the subjective thoughts, feelings, impressions of the poetic persona. So number 5, without having to pass beyond the 6 realms, I reach transcendence, and the myriad ties are forgotten. Well, remember, the poetic persona is climbing the mountain not just for enjoyment of its beauty, like perhaps Shailin Yu might have done a few centuries earlier, or scholar officials. There is a religious impulse in this going up, which apparently is satisfied in this 5th couplet. Being in communion with nature, the poet achieves transcendence, breaks all his ties to the world, and he goes, he doesn't need to transcend, to pass beyond the 6 realms, where the 6 realms are probably the 6 directions of the mundane world. Yeah. That is the 4 cardinal directions, and up and down in Chinese cosmology. And he lets go. He is in a place where he can commune with the immortals and maybe transcend and become one himself. So he rejects the world. And the last 6th couplet hammers in the idea. Yeah? I put my faith in those gentlemen of days long gone, roosting among the cliffs, the way entirely manifests itself. So he follows the footsteps of those Daoist sages of yore who went into mountains and maybe achieved transcendence and or long life. He himself, like them, is roosting among the cliffs, and the way becomes clear. The way, remember, Daoists are very skeptical of cultural, social interpretations of the truth and of the way, and they generally believe in that the way of achieving them is renouncing the world and communing with nature and rejecting logic and reason. So that's it. So altogether, a very good representative of typical landscape poetry with a Taoist tone of abandoning the world and transcending it and its petty interests and values.